Hi, my name is Sunny, and I'm a volunteer with the Happy Fest committee. I'll be the moderator for this QA, and if you have any questions for our guests, please comment in the YouTube comment section and we'll answer them live. Any questions we won't get to will be forwarded to the filmmaker. And I'd like to start off by giving a warm welcome to the director, Mochitsuki Sky Bergman, joining us from San Lisbon, California.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us and taking time out of your day. I just want to start off by kind of asking about another film that you made, Lives Well Made, and how that kind of brought you to this film. I had read that you decided to make this documentary short after meeting one of the Ito family members when you were working on Lives Well Lived.
Yeah.
So, yeah, like what made you decide to expand upon this story in particular?
Well, I should say Susie Edo-Bauman has become a really good friend of mine. And I made a film, as you mentioned, Lives Well Lived, where I interviewed 40 people, 75 and older, who are living full lives. And Susie was one of those people. And I felt it was really important when I was making the film. I really wanted to have a diverse group of stories. And so Susie had been interned during World War II in this country, and I thought that was a very important story to tell. And so we become friends since then. And her family gets together every year and makes mochi, and I was so enthralled by that. I should mention that my brother is married to a Japanese woman, and they live in Japan, and they have 2 kids. And on the same day that I was filming the mochitsuki ceremony here, they were making mochi with their grandparents in Japan. And so I love that. I think the more personal a story, the more universal it becomes. And so for me, it's a way to connect to my nephews and to that side of my family, and to feel like I'm part of it, even though I'm thousands of miles away. And the Edo family has been really wonderful and just kind of adopted me. And so one of the things that I really love about that that whole event is this bringing together of generations, and through food. And so it took a few years, because they only do it once a year, as you know, and so it took a few years to do it. But it was really wonderful that they opened that up and let me film it.
Oh, that's so sweet. And you're right, food does have like the amazing power to really bring people together, even thousands of miles away.
Absolutely.
Just thinking about that, I was just wondering what you think the role of mochi and this food-based custom plays in diasporic families like the Edo family, who has been doing this for generations and has suffered through this historical trauma, but is continuing to do this custom. I think you mentioned in an earlier interview that the Edo family mentioned that there were also like people in the internment camps, in those incarceration camps, who were still practicing mochitsuki.
Right. I think that, there's something wonderful about, I come from my one grandmother was Italian, and we had that tradition of coming together through food. And that actually was what inspired the Lives Will Live film, was her, as you can see her in the background with her cooking spoons. And so I think that I love that idea of the generations coming together through food, because through food, as we're cooking, we're also passing down that knowledge. And I'm all about creating those intergenerational connections. One of the things when I was working on the Lives Will Live film that I read was that the last 100 years is the first time in human history that we've looked to anyone other than our elders for advice. Wow. And I really feel the world is suffering. So anytime that I see those intergenerational connections, and anytime I can help foster that, I love to make that happen. And the mochitsuki is there. That's one of those examples where there's about 150 people that come from up and down the West Coast, from San Diego all the way up to Washington, and they gather for this festival once a year. And it's just so lovely to see all the different generations coming together, and the cousins who haven't seen each other in a year, and all that. It's just lovely to see everybody get together. So, and I think every culture has that in it. And, and for me, this was what I learned when I was working with Susie, is that this was their one big event for that family, was making the mochi.
Yeah, definitely. I think that you really show that through the film.
Thank you.
And I was just wondering, because I noticed in the film that you were talking about this kind of generational passing down of knowledge and customs but you did interview so many of you were able to interview so many of the elder members of the Edo family. So I guess like what made you decide to interview them in particular? How did you decide who to interview? What's that thought process like?
Well, part of it is I really did want to have the story about what the Mochisuki was like and what they remembered, because I think that otherwise, if we don't capture that, those stories are lost. And so that was really important to capture those stories, but also to hear from some of the younger people, who talk about, oh, my grandfather runs a show, but I love this. And you can just see the love that she has for her grandfather in that film is
Mm.
so wonderful. But I think that it really, I wanted to capture the history and what people still remembered about why they made mochi. And like I said, Ron, who's in the movie, talks about still making it in the internment camp. And I think that
Mm.
that persists, like that tradition, I think, persists through the greatest of challenges.
Definitely. Food is interest. Food is one of the best ways to keep traditions alive.
Yes.
I would argue. I do notice just in general that it seems like Asian American food is often what is the most visible representation of Asian America in this sort of cultural landscape we're seeing right now. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that and why you think that is, and what drew you in particular to centering your film on food.
Well, I think that that's a really good question. I think that that's true for a lot of cultures. If you think about the thing that defines them, sometimes it's like the food that defines them. And I actually think that the Mochisuki could be the beginning of a feature-length film where I look at other cultures and what is the food that brings those generations together? Because I think if you look at any culture, like I was talking to somebody the other day who's Polish, and it was about making pierogies, and in my family was
Mm.
about getting everybody together, make pasta, and there are these like tamales for Mexican, a lot of Mexican families, and so I think that there is that, and that's such a wonderful way that we can bring people together, and why not showcase that? I think we all eat, we all have to eat, right? I mean, that's the thing that we all have in common is that we all have to eat, but we all have these different things that are very special and unique, I think, to our culture. And so maybe that's part of why we are, that's one of the things that really is a visible representation, is that it's something that we can all try and share,
Mm.
and share in that joy of trying a little taste of somebody else's culture.
Like, I 100% agree. I think a lot of times people's first exposures to other cultures is through food, through trying them at restaurants, things like that too. And you did mention that if you were to make a feature-length version of this film, and I noticed that the film was so short, but it seems like there are so many stories to tell. So did you have to cut a lot out of this documentary? If you were able to make that feature-length that you were talking about version, what would you have liked to include?
Well, I think that, I always say less is more. So it's always better to leave people wanting a little bit more at the end rather than it going too long. I think a lot of documentary films tend to be a little too long. And so I tend to err on the side of making it a little bit shorter and editing it down to something that's really concise. And, so like I said, I think the next step will be looking at other cultures and adding that to make it more of a feature-length film.
That totally makes sense. Yeah. And then I guess through this process of making this documentary, you had captured so many different stories and were able to, it seemed like, really follow this family through this tradition. And so I feel like on camera, everything looks really easy and everything, but did you come across any challenges in the process of making this film?
I think the biggest challenge was that it only happens, the whole Mochisuki ceremony only happens once a year. So I actually filmed it over 2 separate years over a 3-year period. And that was fine because I really got to know the people who were part of it. I mean, I knew Susie, but I really got to know the rest of the family. And I think that shows. I mean, one of the things that I think is really important when you're interviewing somebody is I never just go with my cameras the first time. I
Mm.
always just go and meet them and talk to them. And so it's more of a conversation rather than it feeling like an interview. I have very few cameras. I really try and keep it very minimal. And so I think the biggest challenge was just that I knew it was going to take a long time just because of what I was shooting. But that was it. I mean, I loved every minute of it. So it never felt like a challenge.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I think that you're right that it it is sort of a challenge to capture this event that only happens once a year. And I guess when you were making this film, was there anything new that you learned just by being able to get so close to the process of Mochitsuki itself and the family? Was there anything that surprised you at all?
Well, I what surprised me is how chewy mochi is. I mean, I didn't know. I never really had tasted it before, and but also I just love the beauty of making it. I mean, there's something about you're forming the balls and the flour all over and the pounding of the rice. It's such a ritualistic event, and it just I guess maybe that surprised me, and also how everyone really came together to make it, and just that it was just wonderful to be part of all of that.
Yeah, mochi is a surprising texture for
Yeah, it
sure at
does.
first. It's it's honestly my favorite food, so I'm glad that you got to try it through making this film.
Yeah.
And I guess when you were talking about um, filming it, and I remember there's a scene in which the little boy puts mochi powder on his face to show that he is part of this, and you talk about how ritualistic this is. Do you think there's this sort of performativity to it in one sense of it, or do you think that that was just sort of the little boy um, having some sort of fun?
No, well, I think it's a little bit of both, but I mean, I think that it definitely when you're seeing them pounding and they're moving their hand and pounding and moving their hand, it's almost like a dance in a way. And, I mean, you have to be really careful because you could get hurt with that, but to watch it, it is. I get scared every time I watch it when he puts his hand in there,
Oh
but
my
there
gosh.
something very rhythmic about it and very almost choreographed in a way. It's really quite beautiful to watch. So I think it's a little bit of both. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think kind of circling back to something that we talked about a little bit at the beginning, you mentioned that you got really close to this family. And so I was just kind of curious, like, what is your relationship to this family now? Are you still in touch with them at all?
Yeah. Oh no, I'm really close to all the people that I interviewed for the Lives Well Lived film, and then this family in particular. They live here in town, so
Oh.
I talk to them. I now in this time I'm emailing them and calling them, and
Mm.
so yeah, we stay in touch. I think that that's part of the beauty of doing these films is that you meet people that you might not ever have met otherwise, and you have new friendships, and what a gift that is.
That's amazing. I'm glad that you are still keeping in touch with them, even during this very strange time. Yeah. And then a last question I'll ask you is about the census. So, as a volunteer with OCA Greater Houston, we're working specifically as community advocates to try to empower individuals to register to vote and fill out the census, especially considering this year is very important. 2020 is a census year and an election year. So, it's a really important time if you want to make a difference. And so, I just want to ask you if you have any thoughts on why it's important to fill out the census to register to vote, even during lockdown.
Absolutely. I did another short film, which you guys can see if you go to forevervoters.com, about the League of Women Voters going into the high schools and trying to get people to register to vote. And the students here in California, you can pre-register when you're 16. And as the students said, if you want to make a difference, you have to get out there and vote. And especially in this time when there's so much happening in the world and in our country and so much turmoil, if we want to have a difference, it's great that there's all these rallies and these people are out there, but they need to also have their voice heard by being part of the census and getting out and voting. So please register to vote and then use your voice and vote on election day.
Thank you so much. I think that was put so well. And so that really concludes our Q&A, but I just want to give you the chance to talk about
Life well lived.
Lives Well Made, and
So
its
Lives Well
upcoming
Lived,
showing.
yeah, I'm really excited because Lives Well Lived is going to be part of AARP's Movies for Grownups screening, and that's on Friday, June 12th. So please tune in. It's totally free. The website is on the screen right now. You can also go to Lives Well Lived. You can just Google it and you'll see it, and the DVD's available. But we hope you'll join us for our AARP Movies for Grownups, and you'll see Susie and her story about about being interned and what that was like for her family is a big part of that film.
Amazing. I'm so excited about it. Thank you again for
Yeah,
taking time to
thank
speak
you
to
so
us.
that was great. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, and please follow Sky on her social media platform shown below. Thank you guys for joining us today. I'd like to invite all of y'all to our next film titled The World is Bright, playing immediately after this. Feel free to go to happyfest.com for the full schedule. And just before we end, I'd really like to bring attention to the current racial injustices that our Black communities are facing right now. We, as Asian American Pacific Islanders, are standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. So please visit tinyurl.com. It's put on the screen after this to learn more concrete ways that you can get involved right here in Houston. We'll also be conducting a special panel next week to discuss the current climate and these racial injustices and ways that we can further engage and implement our calls to action. So stay tuned for that. And on behalf of OCA Greater Houston, thank you for joining us at Happy Fest and have a lovely afternoon. We would like to acknowledge the grief and outrage right now, especially within our Black communities. Our city, Houston, continues to hurt. George Floyd was a native Houstonian, and according to the Houston Chronicle, we have had 6 police killings this past month alone.
As Asian Americans, we have to acknowledge and interrogate our own anti-Blackness and relative privilege within American society. We have to actively unlearn our own biases. It was Black activists who pushed against racist naturalization laws and supported Asian Americans after the racist murder of Vincent Chen.
Black activists stepping into action have benefited our community in profound ways. We must move beyond being a bystander and join the larger movement of Black Lives Matter. Join us in donating, protesting, petitioning, educating ourselves, and supporting our Black brothers and sisters in whatever way we can. Visit tinyurl.com/BLMAAPI, all caps, for more detailed ways to help, including Houston-specific bail funds, scripts to call local representatives, and translated letters to our family members, all of which you can join us in doing in between screenings. On behalf of OCA Greater Houston and the Happy Fest Committee, thank you for joining us on this podcast.